This is Judaism Unbound, episode 443, Maimonides, Judaism for the Perplexed. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're diving into a time period we haven't explored so much on Judaism Unbound, the 12th century. And we're going to learn about one of Judaism's greatest philosophers, Maimonides, also known as Rambam, with our guest today, Lenn E. Goodman, who recently co-created a translation of Maimonides' book, The Guide to the Perplexed, which is a readable version of what has until today been a pretty perplexing read. Before we dive in, though, it's hard to believe, but we're getting closer and closer to the new Jewish year, which is going to begin on Rosh Hashanah. Elul, the month that begins exactly a month before Rosh Hashanah, the on-ramp month that leads into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, starts at the beginning of September. And for years, this has been a special month at Judaism Unbound, in which we've explored that on-ramp. So if you'd like to be part of Judaism Unbound's journey through the month of Elul this year, which we call Elul Unbound, just head over to judaismunbound.com/Elul, that's E-L-U-L, and click the button to sign up for our Elul email list. There's going to be bonus podcast content, Zoom gatherings, and a lot more, so don't miss it. And now for today's conversation with Lenn E. Goodman. As I said, Lenn Goodman, along with his colleague at Vanderbilt University, Philip I. Lieberman, has recently put out a translation and commentary of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. It's called The Guide to the Perplexed, a new translation. And we needed a new translation because the guide can feel like a pretty dense work of 12th century philosophy, but it doesn't have to. In addition to the translation of the guide, Lenn Goodman also put out a book called The Guide to the Perplexed that helps make the guide less perplexing through essays about Maimonides' life, his travels, the context of his times, his other works, and what he's trying to do in the guide. It's an outstanding intellectual biography of Maimonides in its own right, and a wonderful companion for anyone who wants to take a deep dive into The Guide to the Perplexed, which after this conversation will hopefully include you. Lenn Goodman is professor of philosophy and Jewish studies and Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. In addition to the translation of The Guide to the Perplexed and The Guide to the Guide, he is the author of The Holy One of Israel, Judaism, A Contemporary Philosophical Investigation, Judaism, Human Rights and Human Values, and God of Abraham, which won the Gratz Centennial Prize, and lots of other books. Lenn Goodman's work in Jewish philosophy was the focus of a volume in Brill's Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers, and he's also well known for his studies of Islamic philosophy and culture. Lenn Goodman was the first winner of the American Philosophical Association's Baumgart Memorial Prize. Lenn Goodman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's my pleasure.
So when I was thinking about this conversation with you, it brought to mind this thing that one of our early guests, Richard Elliott Friedman, talked about. And he said he was an Old Testament guy. And so his view of the world is kind of, the Torah and the prophets and the Book of Kings, etc. And then yada, 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 John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And I was sort of thinking about how in liberal Jewish circles in particular, for the most part, people focus, if they focus on Jewish texts at all, it's the Torah. Every once in a while, some people will talk about the Talmud, but it almost feels like liberal Judaism has forgotten that anything happened between the Talmud and the Enlightenment. So when the book that you and Phil Lieberman translated, Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, came out, I was really excited because the idea that there would be an accessible English translation of such an important book in Jewish history felt like maybe it's going to be something that brings Maimonides back into the conversation, not only in the Orthodox world, but also in the liberal Jewish world. So I wanted to ask you basically why that would be important. Like, what do you think Maimonides was up to that our discourse about Judaism is missing if we don't have access to Maimonides' work?
We are too easily dismissive of medieval work. I think it's Shaw has a character, I think it's in St. John, a character refers to, we men of the Middle Ages. People who lived in the Middle Ages didn't think of themselves as people of the Middle Ages. They thought of themselves as moderns. And you'll find one of the things that you'll observe in the translation, or any reader will observe in the translation, is Maimonides refers to recent thinkers as moderns. He also refers to ancients like Plato and Aristotle. And why is this medieval book so relevant today? Couple reasons. You started out, as you said rightly, with the Torah. And the Torah is the constitution of Judaism. It's the intellectual spine of Judaism. But like any constitution, it needs to be interpreted. And one of the points that Maimonides wants to make is that the Torah is very poetic. He opens the book with a kind of letter of dedication to the person for whom he wrote those chapters. He describes what attracted him and made him willing to work with that student. And one of the characteristics of that student, apart from the fact that he was pretty good in logic and he did geometry and mathematics, all subjects that Maimonides thought were important prerequisites of doing philosophical theology, he also mentions that he was impressed with some of the poetic prose that student had written. Why is that important? Because you can't really understand the Torah if you're not alive to poetry. The Torah is all about God and how God wants us to live. But we can't know anything directly about God. That's why it says when Moses encounters God, God tells him, "You can't see my face." That means you can't know the what of God. You have to relate to God in a somewhat different way. The sages in the Talmud say the Torah speaks in accordance with human language. Well, of course, that's the only language we can understand, some human language. But there's another dimension to that idea, and that is that human language can't really describe God. It can only talk about God in a very indirect way, and that is to say, a poetic way. So part of the job of the Guide to the Perplexed is to understand one doesn't get poetry if one tries to take it literally. If you say, "My love is a red, red rose," somebody might get the idea that you've got a fetish about flowers. That's not what you're saying. When you say, "My love is a red, red rose," you're talking about beauty. And although beauty can be seen, beauty itself cannot. As the poet said, Euclid alone has gazed on beauty bare. So you have the difficulty of conveying to people an idea of what God is and what God wants. And the only way you can do that is indirectly. And that indirect form of discourse is poetry. And part of what the Rambam wants to do, Maimonides is called the Rambam in traditional circles, part of what he wants to do is to open up that poetry and show us how we can relate to those images about God. And he wants to bring them to life for us so that they're not just taken literally, which would miss the whole point, or misunderstood entirely.
So I know you wrote a whole additional book about this, the Guide to the Perplexed, but can you give us a little bit of a sketch of who Maimonides was when he lived? You said Middle Ages, right? What he was up to, because one of the other points that you make in your Guide to the Guide was that before Maimonides writes the Guide to the Perplexed, he's kind of got another set of projects which seem quite different, which seem to be more about making the practice of Judaism very simple for people to just know what to do. And that seems almost like the opposite mindset of this kind of poetic, philosophical work that he does in the Guide to the Perplexed.
Wonderful question. Maimonides was a triple threat. He was a practicing physician, wrote 10 medical works, several of them in multiple volumes. He wrote those works in Arabic, and he served as a physician at the court of the people who became the rulers of Cairo. Now, he wasn't born in Egypt. He came to Egypt the hard way. Maimonides was born in 1138. He was born in Cordoba, and some of our listeners will have been to Cordoba or have seen his statue there. That statue there is entirely fanciful, like it's an imaginary figure that's shown there. Nice looking man wearing a turban. In 1148, when Maimonides was 10 years old, a group of Muslim militants conquered they conquered Cordoba, particularly. They were already conquering cities in North Africa where they came from, and they executed anybody who didn't convert to Islam. Christians and Jews were executed if they would not convert to Islam. Many of the Christians were able to escape, because northern Spain was under Christian kings and they were welcomed there as refugees from Andalusia. But Jews didn't have a place to run to or to go. Many did convert, many were martyred. The family of Maimonides seems to have stuck around. The evidence is that they became crypto-Jews. They were secretly Jewish, but outwardly, overtly pretending to be Muslims. Maimonides confesses this is what they did. He said, quoting the prophets, we and our fathers sinned. We lie down in our sin. We're not going to pretend we did anything else. He doesn't believe that Islam was idolatrous, so he doesn't believe that they were directly violating the law, but they did pronounce the Shahada, the Islamic confession of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and that commits you to becoming a Muslim. Well, they had to get out of Cordoba. They seem to have lived in North Africa. He learned medicine, and that's important for Maimonides because, as I said, he was a practicing physician. He did not believe, although he was a learned man and became the most distinguished Jewish scholar of his day and of many days since, he did not believe that one should earn one's living as a rabbi. He thought that that was wrong. He thought that that was using the Torah as a spade to dig with. Although he became a very prominent rabbi, he never took a fee for it. He supported himself and his family by the practice of medicine. But here he is studying Jewish law, becoming a master of the Talmud, and writing a commentary on the Mishnah, and doing his enormous systematization of halakha under the title Mishneh Torah. That's kind of chutzpah title, and many people try to avoid saying that because Mishneh Torah means the Torah all over again, and that's the official Jewish title for the book of Deuteronomy, which is what the word Deuteronomy means.
It's like calling your book like the Torah, the sequel.
Yes, it had that kind of feel to it. The halakha had not really been made systematic before, and it's a remarkable work that he was going to make sense of all the commandments. He thinks that they do intrinsically and inherently make sense, but he was going to make that sense visible and apprehensible to his reader, and he wanted to avoid encouraging people to spend their lives studying halakha. Halakha is Jewish law. He thought Jewish law is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. The Torah is given to teach us how to live a better life. The halakha elaborates and systematizes that system, and it doesn't present itself as a system. The Talmud, as those who read into it know, is very digressive, very repetitious, very associative in its logic. It'll mention that there are 10 things, and suddenly it's off on a tangent about what else is there 10 things of. The third is that he's a philosopher, and he's the most important Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages, and perhaps in some ways the most important Jewish philosopher of all time. He wanted to show you the wisdom of the Torah. He wanted to show you the justice of the biblical law and of the rabbinic elaboration of the biblical law. And he thought that there was a crisis going on with regard to the understanding of the Torah and the rabbinic discourse, as he calls it, in his own time. Halakha had been systematized early on by Judah the Patriarch, and in his own time by his own work in the writing of the 14 volumes of his code of law. But the vehicle of Jewish thought is Agadah. Now, if you learn about Agadah, which is sometimes translated as lore or legend, it's often spoken of very dismissively, because Agadah, by definition, is not halakha. It's not about practice. It's not about norms of practice. It's about stories. And it's a remarkable vehicle to use because of the fact that it's not normative. No one doesn't have to believe, it's not dogmatic. Agadah is the vehicle of Jewish ideas and therefore of Jewish theology and of Jewish philosophy, but it's not dogmatic in the sense of you got to believe this or else. What Maimonides wanted to do was to revitalize the Agadah. That is the project of the Guide to the Perplexed.
I'm really interested to hear more about the Guide to the Perplexed and a particular couple of structural things about it. One, it is for a specific, well, it's actually for a specific person, theoretically. It's a letter written to one person, but it's really for a genre of people, which is to say the perplexed. And as many of us today consider ourselves of the perplexed genre as human beings, but he means a specific set of things by perplexed, or in Hebrew, nevuchim, and he names something that is sort of a lineage, which is sort of a set of Jewish thinkers. He's not the first one. There's actually people that he cites from long before, and people that continue in this lineage, people who look to sort of quote unquote secular thought. That's how we might talk about it today. I know that's not really how we should talk about it for this time period, but people who look to not only the realm of traditional Jewish thought, of Talmud, of Torah, of rabbinics, but also to the broader world. Maimonides was writing this text, the Guide to the Perplexed, and he was citing Greek philosophers, folks writing in Arabic, people who were Muslim, people who were all sorts of different schools of thought. And as somebody who myself strives to do the same and to learn not only from Jewish wisdom, but from our broader world, I was really drawn to that. So I'd love to hear more about who his audience is, who this perplexed person is, and what that might mean for us as followers in that perplexed lineage.
That word nevuchim that you quoted in Hebrew, which is Ibn Tibbon's translation of the title Achairin. Achairin in Arabic just means people who are puzzled, who are confused. But I think Ibn Tibbon was brilliant in using the word nevuchim, because that's a word that occurs only twice in the Torah. Once when the people of Susa first hear of the genocidal decree that Haman had prevailed upon Ahasuerus to impose upon the Jews, that all the Jews had to die, and the Jews were in great consternation. The Hebrew word for that is nevuchim. They were beside themselves. They were really upset. But the other place where the word occurs is at the sea. When Pharaoh was chasing the Israelites, he decided to pursue the slaves that he had first agreed to free, and they had their backs to the sea, and they were trapped. And they were facing a dilemma. They had Pharaoh's chariots on one side, the Sea of Reeds on the other side, and they were stuck. That was not just consternation, that was a dilemma. And that was the brilliant word nevuchim that is used in describing how they felt in that situation. And that kind of dilemma is parallel to the dilemma that Maimonides thinks his reader is in. Anyone who, like ourselves, is exposed to science, to mathematics, to problematizing the issues of philosophical theology, the problem of evil. Why do innocent people suffer? How are such things allowed to happen if God is so good and so wise and so powerful? That's one of the many problems that we face. You don't have to know modern physics. You don't have to know analytic philosophy to be aware of those problems and to confront them. And you can stick your head in the sand and try to avoid them, or you can compartmentalize and say, well, Torah is one thing and the world is another, and the two have nothing to do with each other. But Maimonides was courageous enough to undertake to resolve those problems. One of the problems, you mentioned Aristotle, and one of the things you discover if you read Aristotle, you find out that Aristotle does not believe that the world was created. Aristotle thinks it's unscientific and, in fact, logically impossible to get something from nothing. So the idea of creation was considered by philosophically sophisticated people in Maimonides' time to be an impossibility. And so they faced the dilemma of how is the Torah asking us to believe something which has been demonstrated to be logically impossible? One of the things that he undertakes to do is to show that it's not a logical impossibility. He believes in absolute creation from nothing. He doesn't think it's illogical. He thinks that Aristotle, who argues vociferously against the idea of creation, uses such heat and passion in making that argument that he betrays the fact that he himself didn't believe it was demonstrable that the world was eternal, as he maintained. So that's an example of the kind of point that Maimonides wants to use to free his reader of the consternation facing the kind of dilemma. Do I choose philosophy and science on the one hand, or do I choose Torah and try to reconcile them, or give up on trying to reconcile them and just put them in separate compartments and pay no attention to the disagreement? Rambam wants to help you settle those questions in your own mind. He's a very original, very independent-minded thinker. He's not independent-minded in the sense of ignoring halakha. He's not independent-minded in the sense of bracketing the poetry of the Torah. He wants to resolve the poetry of the Torah and help us to relate to it and help us learn from it and see how the imagery that poetic prophets introduce, how that poetry can teach us something about the world and about ourselves and about our relationships with one another. And he's very, very good at that. I would say that he's a synthetic thinker in the sense that he wants to bring together what he knows about science, what he knows about medicine, what he knows about geometry and astronomy, with what he knows about halakha and agadah and the poetics of scripture.
So I'm curious about the very project of creating an accessible translation to the Guide to the Perplexed. And it puts me in the mind also, you were remarking on books that are on my bookshelf. You saw the book of the collected writings of Philo, but also on my bookshelf is the translation of the Talmud by Adin Steinsaltz, which is also meant to be a very accessible translation, which is done both by translating in a sort of contemporary language, but also, in the case of Steinsaltz, by having this kind of commentary interspersed with the translation. So it almost allows you to read the Talmud in a fluent way. You did that more in the notes and also in this supplementary Guide to the Perplexed. But your project was basically to take this text that for nearly a millennium was a text that would have been understood in Jewish circles as a hard text, something that most people could not read and wouldn't understand. And I'm wondering whether Maimonides would have approved of your project, or whether Maimonides only wanted that text to be accessible to a very particular group that, when you think about who he was writing for, and now we can all read it, that in some ways we're not the right audience from Maimonides' standpoint. I have no objection to it, but I'm wondering how Maimonides would have thought about it, or would Maimonides have said something along the lines of, when I was writing that book, there were only a very few people who could understand what I was talking about. But actually, in the modern world, there are a lot more people who can understand the basic ideas. And so now we have to make that book accessible to them because they're actually capable of understanding what he was trying to get at.
You've, in a way, answered your own question by the second part of what you just said. Maimonides makes it a practice in the Guide to the Perplexed of not stating the problems he's addressing. He doesn't tell you right off the bat that there's a problem about creation. Instead of saying, I'm going to talk about the problem of evil, he talks about, let me tell you about that remarkable book of Job. Anybody who has thought about the problem of evil at all, or has it experienced as he did with the loss of his dearly beloved brother, he knows that people are aware of suffering that seems to be unjustified. He tells you at the beginning of the book that he is concerned with certain kinds of contradictions. The contradictions he's concerned with mainly are apparent contradictions in Scripture. We're given a pretty heavy urging by the Torah itself not to try and describe God, not to try and picture God. Moses is told that he can't see God's face, that God's very essence is not accessible to us. It's too far beyond our finite understanding to apprehend what an infinitely perfect being would be. The prophets are going to use poetic devices to try and take you there, but the poetic devices deconstruct one another. Oftentimes they deconstruct themselves. So if you read in Bereshit, in Genesis, that God was walking in the garden, we know that God doesn't have a body, that God doesn't have feet. What does it mean to say that God was walking in the garden? What does it mean even to say that God sees and God hears? Some of that can be resolved. Saying that God sees and God hears is, for Maimonides, a way of saying that God holds us accountable for the moral and immoral tenor of our actions. And one of the things that Maimonides does in the first few dozen chapters of the guide is to survey the various anthropomorphic terms, terms that in which God is described as if God were a person with a nose that gets hot when he gets angry, with people don't like that, but that's, if you translate it literally, that's what it says in the Hebrew. What does it mean to say that God has passions? Passions are something that living beings have, especially humans, when they get frustrated or when they get desirous. That's a product of our biology. That's not something that belongs to God, who is not a biological creature. And he uses a technique that he learned from Saadia Gaon, the 10th century philosopher and author of the first organized Hebrew Siddur and the first organized Hebrew dictionary and grammar. Saadia Gaon says, if you want to know the meaning of a biblical term, you have to do it from context. You have to look at where all of those occurrences of the term is to be found. Those occurrences can be taken literally, but if they seem to be problematic, if they involve a contradiction, then you're going to have to find another place where the very usage that is necessary is figuratively applied. Maimonides uses that technique, and he surveys all of the occurrences of anthropomorphic terms in the Torah. And what does he find? That there's a hierarchy of senses in which they're used. Sometimes God is said to have a face or a back, and that could just mean the front or the back of a building, or the front of a back of a body, or something like that. Sometimes those terms are used in a moral or social sense, as, for example, when Israelites are warned that if they don't keep the law, they'll go down and down and down. The down there is not geographical. The down there is a matter of status, that they will lose status. Maimonides very tacitly organizes 4 different levels of sense in which those anthropomorphic terms can be taken, starting with the physical and rising up through the social and moral and up to the spiritual and intellectual. And for him, spiritual and intellectual mean the same thing. We have to keep the terms applied to God in their highest sense. So when it says God came, that means that God manifests himself to our understanding. When it says God went, it doesn't mean that God disappeared or went off someplace in the back in the curtains. It means that God made himself less accessible to a person because their mind was clouded by their passions or by their appetitive distractions and so forth. When he gets to the point where he's actually going to offer an argument for God's transcendence of all the language that we normally would apply to God, all the language that the Torah itself applies to God, he's going to argue that thesis in a very broad, very radical way. He's going to say that God has no attributes, that there's no predicate that properly applies to God. There's no language that you can use that properly describes who or what God is. You might think, and some important Jewish philosophers in the past have thought, that Maimonides has left us up the creek without a paddle. He's told us that we can't know anything about God because we can't say anything about God, and we know by saying and say by knowing. Well, if attribute language is ruled out, he seems to have canceled the whole Torah. On the contrary, he has not left you without a paddle. He has given you the tools by which to analyze the figurative language of the Torah so that you can see when anthropomorphic terms are used, you always have to take them in the higher sense. And the orientation of that higher sense is from the physical towards the spiritual. All that language is using human terms, metaphorically, poetically, to point towards the higher, towards the idea of God as the most perfect, the absolutely perfect, the infinitely perfect being.
And would you say that basically that in Maimonides' time, not so many people saw those contradictions or had those concerns, but in a time like ours where pretty much everybody sees those contradictions and has those concerns about the Torah, Maimonides is more necessary than ever and more relevant than ever?
That's exactly why it's so relevant. People who lived in his time, if they were really probing intellects, might ask such questions, or if they were wide readers and were exposed to other philosophers who had raised such questions, they certainly would be aware of those questions, but they wouldn't necessarily know how to deal with them. And then there were plenty of people who sort of stuck their hands in the sand and well, that's not the kind of question that you ask. So I'll tell you something from my college days. I was keeping kosher. I was eating dinner every night at Harvard Hillel with the Orthodox students, and a question would come up about, do you believe in God, and what reasons are there to believe that there is a God? Well, it's a mitzvah to believe in God. This was the kind of answer that the very Orthodox gave me. It's a mitzvah to believe in God, and end of question, end of discussion. What they understood by God or what grounds they had for holding that belief was something that they had been trained to avoid asking. There are relatively few people like that today, even among those who are very Orthodox. We don't hide from questions like that anymore. And Rambam shows us ways of confronting those questions. He's not the only one, but he's very, very good at it.
So I'm really excited about this direction of sort of Maimonides in our time. I think a lot about, in universities, there's the pure math department and the applied math department. There's like pure Rambam and applied Rambam, like what Maimonides said and thought and did in his time. And then there's also how we would channel that in our own time. I'll sort of model one takeaway I have on the front of applied Maimonides in our time, and I'd love to hear some of yours about, like, for our listeners out there, like, okay, so there's this amazing figure, an amazing book, like, how might we mobilize it now? And so my takeaway is the way in which he cites people outside of Jewish tradition. I don't think there was like a clear-cut thing called Jewish tradition in his time in the same way, but like he is deeply familiar with Tanakh, with the Bible. He's deeply familiar with Talmud. And that is not a limiting factor at all. He peppers his thinking with thinkers from, Greek philosophy, with Muslim thinkers, which, by the way, like, because in our world, Christianity is so hegemonic, we don't think about citing Muslim thought as like that big a thing. We would be more wigged out as Jews by citing Christian thought. But like, he was living in a Muslim context. So he was in effect citing thinkers of a group that had a lot more power and hegemony than Jews did, which like a lot of people don't want to do. A lot of people hold as a deep reason to connect to Judaism that you differentiate yourself from the power players, whether that's Christianity or Islam. So I'm like wildly impressed. And I look around at our time and I feel like even very radical, even progressive Jewish folks who are thinking big thoughts about Judaism and how to live it, I don't read a lot of texts I don't read a lot of like texts meant to be quote unquote religious that are citing like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or like similar kinds of religious visionaries of our time. I don't read a lot of texts that are citing the latest thinkers in physics or in other realms of science. Like I find that even very like open-minded, thoughtful Jewish folks who are doing Jewish thinking or trying to craft a Devar Torah for their synagogue or whatever it might be, like we tend to be limited. And if we cite some external figure to Judaism, we feel like we have to give a big reason why that's allowed. And I look at Maimonides as just like, he did it on every other page. So like, that's my takeaway. Are there others?
When Maimonides wanted to find his bearings as a very young man, he wanted to learn logic, and he wrote a little book about logic. He learned how to do logic from Al-Farabi, who was a great logician, lived in the 10th century, happened to be a Muslim. That was very valuable to the Rambam, and you can see how valuable it was in the Mishneh Torah, which is organized in a very logical way and doesn't have the rambling, digressive character of the way the Talmud is not organized. When Rambam faced a problem, it was natural for him to look to that literature, which he considered very sophisticated, and which is very sophisticated even today. One question you might ask is, how is it possible, if God is so infinite and we're so finite, if God is so transcendent and we're here and now, How does God communicate with us? How is it possible for an infinite being to scale himself down? You know, the Kabbalists like to talk about Tzimtzum, the sort of scaling down of God. Well, Rambam can read Plato in Arabic summary, and Plato says our task is to become as like to God as possible. Well, that's similar to what it says in Vayikra, in Leviticus. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy. How is it possible for a human being to be holy like God? We can't be holy like God, but it tells us how to be holy by respecting one another's privacy, by respecting one another's moral concerns and so forth. Love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the way that human beings can be holy. How does God communicate and scale down his demand upon us to our proportions? By saying we have to become as like to God as possible. That means by perfecting our own nature as human beings, not by trying to become infinite, not by trying to become incorporeal. That's not what we are. We have to perfect ourselves as what we are as human beings. The purpose of halakha is to show us the way to do that. We try to bury the dead and visit the sick and clothe the naked and feed the hungry. We emulate what God does, and that's the way in which we become like God. We have, Maimonides learns from his Greek philosophers and physiologists, we have a mind, we have a body. The body can perceive, the mind can think, but in between the two comes imagination. And Al-Farabi believes that the mind is receptive to pure ideas, pure goodness, pure wisdom that comes from the divine. That's wonderful, but it's very abstract to ordinary human beings. They are interested in what they can see and feel and touch and taste. How are you going to reach them? You're going to reach them by way of imagery. And the images that a prophet uses will become part of their way of life and part of their way of thinking. Maimonides learns that. And he learns some very important things about the Hebrew prophets. The Hebrew prophets had dreams and visions. Only Moses saw through a clear lens. But the other prophets besides Moses saw everything symbolically, because what they apprehended philosophically, they had the talent and the imagination and the mind and the linguistic skills of oratory and rhetoric, that they could put those things across to people who would think that they were concrete. One example is Shabbat. An idea doesn't become practical, doesn't become something you can live by unless it's instituted. Shabbat represents two things, and the Torah itself says what it represents. Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, it's a reminder, a symbolic image of the act of creation, because God rested on the seventh day. And Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's a reminder, a symbolic representation of the Exodus from Egypt. What idea is portended by the Exodus from Egypt? Providence. We know God as creator, which sounds very abstract. By our weekly practice of Shabbat, we know God as providential. Shabbat is able, as an institution, to symbolize and make a part of our life by way of practice, an idea which would seem on the face of it to be too abstract for ordinary people to apprehend. So this is one way in which Rambam, Maimonides, puts together what he learned from Tanakh, what he learned from Halakha, what he learned from Midrash, and what he learned from Al-Farabi about the way in which, the Platonic way in which ideas can be put across to people in a way that they will not only accept, but embrace.
So it's funny because a lot of times when we are interviewing a novelist, I'm always worried about giving a spoiler to the book because we really want people to read the book. Usually with a work of nonfiction, we don't think about it that way, in part because realistically most people aren't going to read the book. But in this case, the book is so readable. I really want people to read the book. So I sort of want to ask about, from the perspective of folks out there today who are listening to this, and asking, like, What is some of this kind of secret knowledge that Maimonides had, or maybe it wasn't meant to be a secret, but it was only of interest to a limited number of people, of need to a limited number of people in his own time, and now there's so many people who may need it? I'm just curious, like, if you might share in closing just a couple of tidbits, maybe teasers, of Maimonides' advice to the perplexed that you think would be really useful to people today if they only had access to it.
One important theme that is made much more explicit in the Guide to the Guide, but is a core theme of the Guide to the Perplexed itself, the idea of emanation. Emanation is a term that comes from Neoplatonism, and it's a way of addressing the question of how can an infinite and incorporeal being create and govern and know and communicate with a world which is determinate and not necessarily all perfect, etc. How can that disproportion between God, that discontinuity between God and creation be bridged between God and humanity? All of the problems arising from that question are answered by the Rambam in terms of emanation. Emanation is a term that was Hebraized. It was legitimated in Hebrew usage. Those who are familiar with Kabbalah will know Atzilut is the term that they use for emanation. It's the term that describes the connection between something non-physical and something physical. Radiation, one could say. The Arabic term is faid, and you know it from your newspaper because in the eighth form, faid is intifada, which means an uprising. But in this case, the uprising, the outdwelling or the outpouring is an outpouring of ideas. The way that a non-physical being can communicate with and control and even create physicality is by this kind of intellectual outpouring. There are two images that are biblical, which are used in explaining this idea. For with thee is the source or the fountain of life. By thy light do we see light. It's a wonderful mixed metaphor. Occurs in the Psalms. We can't say God is the fountain of light, but God has the fountain of light. And the life is light, and the light is ideas, and God communicates by communicating ideas. And one thing that I like to point out to my students is that when you get an idea from another person, that person does not lose the idea. It's not like mechanical transfer where if I take money from one account and put it in a different account, there's less money in this account than is now in that account. Doesn't work that way. The person who had the idea and shared the idea hasn't lost the idea. So the reality that God communicates is not diminished in God by being shared with finite beings. That's a beautiful idea. It's a Neoplatonic idea. It comes originally from Plotinus, ultimately from Plato. Reality is always ultimately intellectual. And the higher dimensions that God uses to communicate with us are intellectual. That's where the prophets get their ideas, which they then are able, through the use of imagination, to transmute into images and symbols and rituals and laws and oratory and rhetoric. All those things that we find in the Torah are expressions of the pure idea, which is spread out, broadcast, shared by that kind of emanation. That's a theme to follow as you read the guide, and I hope our hearers will be reading it. And I urge them, don't get discouraged, don't stop. Things that you didn't notice at the beginning will become much more meaningful at the end. That is the way Maimonides addresses those questions about the discontinuity, the disproportion, which make revelation and creation seem to be problematic, and yet they are problems that do have an answer.
Well, Lenn Goodman, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for making the Guide to the Perplexed available to us regular people.
It's my pleasure.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder, Dan mentioned it at the top, but Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are not so far away. We are nearing that time that I know is not always folks' favorite. We're leaving the summer behind. We are entering into some heavy kinds of holidays, but Elul, the final month of the Jewish calendar year, is coming up, and that means Elul Unbound, our Judaism Unbound initiative marking the on-ramp month into the new Jewish year, is coming too. So if you would like to be part of our Elul Unbound email list, if you want to be notified about all of our bonus podcasts, all of our Zoom gatherings, all the great stuff we do to prep for this new Jewish year, just head to judaismunbound.com/ELUL. That's judaismunbound.com/ELUL and sign up. You can do so right now. Elul is about a month away as this episode is released. You don't want to miss it, so do it before you forget. And as we close out, we want to, of course, encourage you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. There's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can check out all sorts of resources, including show notes for this episode, including at those show notes, a place for you to click and then purchase Lenn Goodman's amazing translation of the Guide for the Perplexed. So head there, and you can email Dan and I at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We also are greatly appreciative if you are able to set aside a financial gift to support us. It means the world, and you can do so on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.